In this section, we're talking about the home front, and our essential question is, how did the war affect Americans at home? So after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, we began to mobilize the military. After Pearl Harbor, over 60,000 men volunteered to serve in World War II. It was good that we had this many volunteers because we were fighting a two-front war in World War II. We were fighting the Japanese in the Pacific and Germany and Italy in Europe. Between 1941 and 42, the military doubled in size. We can see here some of the numbers, the increase in the military, the Navy, and the Marines. And we also saw an increase in minorities who were volunteering for service during World War II. 300,000 Mexican Americans volunteered to serve, 25,000 Native Americans, many of them from the Navajo Nation. We'll talk about them later on. 1 million African Americans, as well as 350,000 women. President Roosevelt said to Congress 1 month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, "Powerful enemies must be outfought and outproduced. It is not enough to turn out just a few more planes, a few more tanks, a few more guns, a few more ships than can be turned out by our enemies. We must outproduce them overwhelmingly so that there can be no question of our ability to provide a crushing superiority of equipment in any theater of the World War." And that is exactly what we did in becoming the great arsenal for democracy. So, after mobilizing the military, we mobilize industry. We began to mobilize our economy to support the war effort. Once again, just like in past wars, this involves the government overseeing industry. So the War Production Board oversaw the conversion of peacetime industry to war industry. So for example, instead of building cars in car factories, we are building instead tanks, planes, weapons, ammunition, things that are needed to supply the war effort. During the 4 years that America was at war, only 139 cars were made across the United States. 139. Instead, we are creating war materials. All factories switch over to wartime production, producing the goods necessary to win the war. At a wartime conference, Joseph Stalin, our ally in the Soviet Union, toasted to American production, without which the war would have been lost. The war ended up costing America $330 billion. All right. How do we pay for this? First of all, through raising taxes. We saw the marginal tax rate go up to 70% for some of the wealthiest Americans to cover this war. Also, the sale of war bonds, which we talked about during World War I. Another government agency that was created during the war was the Office of Price Administration, which gave the government the authority to control wages and set maximum prices within industry. It also coordinated rationing. Americans during World War II were issued coupon books that limited the amount of certain goods they can buy. Remember, during World War I, rationing was encouraged but not required. That changes during World War II. We need to be much more conserving during this war to fund the massive effort that America is making. Certain goods that were limited: sugar, butter, gasoline, rubber. We reduced the national speed limit across the United States to conserve gas. We brought back the meatless Mondays, the wheatless Tuesdays, to encourage Americans to ration things that they weren't forced to ration. And we encouraged Americans to plant victory gardens once again to save food for the troops. So here are more propaganda posters, World War II era. The Office of War Administration was created during World War II, which worked with the media to support the war effort. Their main job was issuing propaganda, films, posters that reminded Americans why they should support the war, reminded them of the reason for war, which was preserving democracy by defeating dictatorships. Preserving democracy was our reason for getting involved in this war. So we can see an example of that propaganda here. Americans will always fight for liberty in order to encourage those who are still on the fence that they should be supporting the war effort. Women played their most major role yet in an American war during World War II. We know that women have always taken control of family farms while men volunteered to serve their country. They've always took up the burden in the factories. They have carried the load at home. That increases during World War II. We also see women officially serving in the military in higher numbers than ever before. 350,000 women during World War II. The Women Army Corps is created. They were called WAC, W-A-C. This was when women were allowed to officially serve in non-combat roles. So they mostly served as clerical workers, truck drivers, instructors, lab technicians, all that jazz. Queen Elizabeth II, the current Queen of England, served as a truck driver during World War II. Obviously not in our Army Corps, but that's just an example for you. Many women joined the Army Nurse Corps, which was created in 1901 to continue that role as nurses in the military. There were also all women branches of the Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, all created. That's what the WAVES, SPARS, WASP, and WAFs are. Women branches of the United States military. And despite the fact that they served, many women did not receive military benefits after the war. We're going to talk about the GI Bill. In our next unit, women were usually excluded from those benefits. So women at home is where they really picked up the burden of the war. Over 200,000 women entered the workforce, many for the first time during the war. They took the place of men that left to serve in the war. So often they were working in heavy industries, jobs that usually were not open to women. Rosie the Riveter, seen here and also seen on my classroom wall on a daily basis, represented women who worked in the factories during the war and was also propaganda to encourage more women to join the war effort by getting jobs within the factories and industry. Just like after World War I, many of these women are replaced whenever men come home from war. Their opportunities do decline after the war, but once again, we see a step for women's rights during the war. So here are some real life Rosie the Riveters. Even though there was a massive production effort during the war and all hands were needed on deck, many African Americans still faced discrimination in the workforce. During World War II, over 100,000 people were hired to work in the aircraft industry. Out of those 100,000, only 240 of them were African Americans. So once again, we saw African Americans being resigned to the lowest paid jobs, the toughest jobs and being excluded from many of the work opportunities that were extended to others. So during World War II, we saw the creation of the Double V campaign. Double V is double victory. So African Americans were fighting against fascism abroad, because many African Americans are serving in the military, and victory against discrimination at home. So African Americans were fighting their own two-front war within the United States. Victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against discrimination. This is a Philip Randolph. He was a major leader during World War II, the Double V campaign. He was also a leader throughout the civil rights movement as well. However, FDR wanted to focus on the war, not civil rights. We've discussed the fact that FDR didn't take up civil rights because it was an unpopular political move. During the war, civil rights is not his focus. However, under pressure, he issued the Executive Order 8802. Executive orders are issued by presidents that don't have to go through Congress, an action he can take on his own, which established fair hiring practices in the defense industry. So to get rid of issues like the 240 African Americans out of 100,000 Americans working in the aircraft industry, and jobs that were funded with government money. So trying to limit some of that job discrimination that was plaguing the African American community. This executive order also established the Fair Employment Practice Committee to enforce these requirements. African Americans were also encouraged to join groups like the NAACP, which we've talked about, and CORE, an early civil rights organization. And CORE stands for Congress of Racial Equality. The goal of both of these to fight segregation. So we really saw the birth of the 50s and 60s civil rights movement during World War II. Take a moment to look at this political cartoon. Another issue that the war brought up was the fact that many people were leaving rural areas to go fight in the war or to go work in industry, limiting the number of people left to work on the farms. So in order to make sure that we were still feeding both the citizens at home and our allies abroad, the U.S. partnered with Mexico to create the Bracero program. The Bracero program brought laborers from Mexico to U.S. farms. So they were migrant laborers who were allowed to live in the United States for months out of the year in order to provide the labor that we needed to continue fueling our farms and our agriculture. So this was extremely important to the war effort, this program. However, the increase of migrant workers to the United States also caused some backlash, some racial violence against Mexican youths and Mexican American youths. The Los Angeles Zoot Suit riots was when young Mexican and Mexican American youths were attacked by mobs of off-duty sailors who were currently in LA. They got drunk, got rowdy, and started walking through the streets, beating up random young men in the Mexican areas of LA. So they attacked these zooters. The word zoot comes from these stylish suits that were popular at the time, for no reason other than the fact that they were Mexican or had Mexican heritage. Whenever the police showed up to These incidents, often they arrested the victims, not the attackers. We can see here many of the victims, they are in jail. Another incidence of racism during World War II was the internment of Japanese Americans. All right, there was a fear of Japanese Americans during this time that they would instead be loyal to Japan instead of to America, even though they were born in America, raised in America, and most of them were loyal Americans. A lot of this fear was increased by propaganda that painted the Japanese as evil and unloyal and traitors to the United States. So the U.S. government issued orders to round up all Japanese Americans living on the West Coast and sent them to internment camps. This happened over the course of a couple of months, not long after the United States entered the war, and many of the Japanese Americans stayed there for years. The rest of the time, America was fighting in the war. These camps had armed guards, barbed wire, harsh living conditions. Before Japanese Americans went to these camps, they were forced to sell their homes, sell their businesses. Because they were sold so quickly, they were often for a lot less than they were worth. Some didn't get the opportunity to sell it all, and they just lost everything prior to going into these camps. So even though these camps were not death camps, we didn't put Japanese Americans to death, even though some of them died from the harsh conditions. We still did this because of racial stereotypes and racial fears, and for many of these families, it cost them everything. A court case went before the Supreme Court in 1944, Korematsu versus the United States, which challenged the use of the camps. All right. The camps were set up by another executive order from FDR, Executive Order 9066. The Supreme Court upheld the legality of the policy. They said that the concentration camps, the internment camps were fine. They were well within the law because wartime security trumps civilian rights. So we basically, the executive branch issued the orders and the judicial branch said that it was indeed constitutional. In 1988, the United States government officially apologized for their actions during the war regarding the use of internment camps and paid reparations of $20,000 to living internees. Many Japanese Americans did join the war effort to fight on the side of the Allies. One regimental combat team, the 442nd, was an all Nisi, which means native-born Japanese American, an all Nisi combat team who volunteered to fight. They were formed into one battalion, and they became the most decorated battalion in Europe. They were nicknamed the Purple Heart Battalion because out of the 14,000 that served over the course of the war, over 9,000 earned Purple Hearts for the service to their country.